Chapter 4, Readiness Processing Center, Fort Hood, Texas, Thursday, November 5th, 2009. Stacey McClure would be the very first to tell you that she is, not was, an Army brat. She was born on an Army base, Fort Benning, went to school on several Army bases, kissed her first boy on an Army base, Fort Sill, and found her true calling on an Army base, Fort Belvoir. A 9-year-old Stacey got dragged by her father, Captain Patrick Bullseye McClure, a highly decorated weapons instructor, to the Fort Belvoir range to keep his already very sharp skills even sharper. Bullseye came by his nickname naturally. He was one of a handful of truly standout marksmen in the Army and won or placed in competitions the world over. Unfortunately for Captain McClure, he was very fond of Bullseye cocktails. Dry gin, either hard cider or ginger liqueur, orange juice, and lemon juice, having been introduced to them at his first shooting competition 10 years before. He was, however, also an excellent instructor. Both reasons explain why his family was constantly on the move from base to base. He helped teach raw recruits to fire the weapon they were going into combat with, from a service revolver all the way up to artillery pieces. At night, he would ease his rage over the lack of advancement with his favorite beverage. Bullseye's favorite pupil would end up being his daughter Stacey. That fateful day at the shooting range, Stacey, as she had what seemed like hundreds of times before, begged her daddy to let her shoot, to let her try. "I can do it, Daddy. I can. I really can." Finally, Bullseye had had enough. He took out his standard Beretta M9 service revolver, checked to make sure the safety was on, and started to put Stacey in the proper firing position. "Daddy, I know how to stand and hold the gun. I've watched you do it millions of times." She stood there, holding the weapon toward the target, looking for all the world like a mini bullseye. "You ready, honey? Flip the switch, Daddy." Bullseye flipped the safety switch, stepped behind his daughter, and watched as this 9-year-old kid outshot one of the best pistol shooters in the country. He was stunned. She was beaming. "Daddy, reload. Let me try again." He did. She did, even better than before. Fast forward 9 years, Stacey is 18 and has won countless shooting competitions around the country, both state, regional, and national. Captain McClure has been with her every step of the way, coaching, guiding, encouraging. Unfortunately, the family has still been moving around the country, and Captain Bullseye McClure has remained a captain, all due to his increased alcohol use. There have been incidents: assaults in officers' clubs, plural, physically berating, pushing, threatening, grabbing, both lower-grade officers and soldiers, but also in 2 cases, equal or higher-ranked officers. He has spent time in the brig of several posts. He has come before several review boards. The only thing that kept Bullseye McClure from being dishonorably discharged was his many shooting titles, his excellent record as an instructor, although his addiction was beginning to affect his abilities there as well, and for the last couple of years, the possibility of his daughter Stacey, with her many shooting titles, volunteering. Alcohol. Drinking way to excess. Drinking until you become a totally different person. An angry, mean, vicious, violent person. Both his wife and his daughter had the scars and bruises to attest to it, yet both stayed with him. June 15, 1998. They were stationed at Fort Belvoir again, living on base in officers' quarters. It was a Monday, a full busy day for Bullseye, and the same for his daughter. The commanding officers had taken a liking to this 5-foot 5-inch ball of energy and had allowed her to practice in the main shooting range when there were no classes, or at the auxiliary range. She spent the day shooting her dad's old Beretta M9 revolver, practicing for the 1st Virginia shooting event where she'd be participating as an adult. She arrived back home to the sound of breaking glass and yelling. "Dad," she thought. She closed the door, looked to her right, and there was her mother. On the floor, a jagged cut on her forehead, blood pouring down her face, crying, pleading with him to just go away. Neither of them heard Stacey enter. As his father raised the jagged blood-stained bottom of a vase, fully intending to slam it onto his wife's face, they both heard an unmistakable click. there Stacey stood, in the firing position taught to her by the drunk in front of her, one eye staring at the target, another along the sight line. Not a waver, not a quiver, no tears, nothing but very grim determination. Dad, I love you. I don't want to do this, but if you move that glass anywhere other than tossing it into the corner, I'm going to stick this bullet in your fucking right eye. No waver, no quiver. She meant it. And she never swore that was the first time either of her parents had ever heard it. Bullseye didn't think she'd do it. Of course, he was hammered. He looked at his wife, saw red, and in his almost blacked out drunkenness quickly raised the vase. The bullet entered his right eye and blew out the back of his head. He was dead before he hit the floor. Stacey's mother screamed, pulled herself off the floor, staggered over to Stacey, and slapped her face. How could you do that to your father? Then passed out in Stacey's arms due to loss of blood. Both the Fairfax County and Fort Belvoir police investigated. Both very quickly found the incident a case of domestic violence on the part of Captain McClure, and that Stacey McClure discharged her weapon to save her mother's life. Her mother didn't feel that way. On her return from the base hospital, she ordered Stacey out of the house, never forgave her for killing the man she loved, and never spoke another word to her daughter for the rest of her life. Stacey went right on from her mother's living room to the base commander's office. A few favors were called in, and by the next Wednesday, June 22nd, Stacey McClure was Private McClure, undergoing basic training at Fort Jackson in Columbia, South Carolina. The incident, as it was called in her official record, included the official police record absolving her, as well as a glowing letter of recommendation from the Fort Belvoir commander. That letter included a detailed review of her shooting skills. Once she completed boot camp, PFC McClure was assigned to the Army Marksmanship Unit competition teams, participating at one time or another for the next 9 years in the shotgun, action shooting, service pistol, and service rifle arenas. She participated both on a national and a world stage, helping the Army team to victories and placements. However, it was her teaching skills that boosted her career with their superiors. Members of the service rifle and service pistol teams are expected to conduct the Small Arms Firing School, SAFS, at the national shooting matches held at Camp Perry, Ohio, every year. The teams aren't teaching other soldiers, they're teaching the public. And by far the most able, the most relaxed, the most talented teacher was PFC, then Specialist, then Corporal, then Sergeant McClure. She was not only able to convey the mechanics of shooting in an easy-to-understand and emulate fashion, but she also stressed the safety aspects, perhaps even more so than the mechanics. She earned rave reviews from her students as well as her team members. Finally, on November 7, 2008, her 29th birthday, she was promoted to Staff Sergeant Stacey McClure and transferred to Fort Hood, Texas, the most populous U.S. military installation in the world, there to serve as a shooting instructor for the units being transferred overseas. She loved Fort Hood. If any place in the world screamed out U.S. Army, it was Fort Hood. Over 53,000 occupants living and working within 214,000 acres of land. It contained, on a normal day, about 45,000 assigned soldiers and about 9,000 civilian employees. Stacey thought she'd died and gone to heaven. She lived, worked, played, exercised, and prayed on base. Didn't mind the heat, had no desire to head anywhere else. If a person can discover home in another place than the spot they're born in, Stacey had found it. 16 different brigades, battalions, thousands of soldiers to teach how to dismantle, clean, reassemble, handle, sight, and fire accurately their rifle and sidearm. Luckily for those men and women, the absolute best teacher the Army had to offer was now on base, and Sergeant McClure loved every minute of it. She knew where they were heading. She knew they were scared. Every time a soldier stared down the sight of their M16, M4, or Beretta sidearm, she or he knew that one day in the not-so-distant future that they would have to stare down that sight line at a fellow human being and pull the trigger before they ended up dying. That was the very first thing that Stacey used to tell her classes. "Remember the movie Patton?" she'd say, almost hollering above the din that was a Fort Hood typical day. Most of them, being in their teens and 20s, hadn't. If you have not, the general makes a clear, particularly important statement toward the beginning of the movie. Look it up. He says it better than I do. I'll paraphrase here. She had it memorized. He said, and pay close attention. By this point, they're all gathered around her, leaning in. Now I want you to remember, pause for emphasis, growl in her voice, that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. Laughter. She would always interject here. I believe General Patton would have also said bitches too, if he'd had any girls in his army. Big laughs, especially from the females. She would always hold her hand up, then one finger. At this point, everyone knew what was coming. He or she won it by making the other poor dumb bastard or bitch die for their country. Laughter and applause. That was Stacey's way of letting him know that her mission was important. She wanted no one dying on her watch because they could not operate totally and completely any of the weapons they were issued. Because of her opening statement, she would always call her classes her bastards and bitches, and those soldiers wore it with honor and pride. At the end of every class, she would give out a special award to her top bastard and top bitch in each class, a laminated 5x7 card that had a photo of the real General Patton on the front, along with a quote, doctored by Sergeant McClure. On the back was their name, rank, date, and the phrase top bastard or top bitch, signed by Staff Sergeant Stacey McClure. The cards became legendary, as well as a way of introduction. If one soldier found that another soldier was from Fort Hood, the next question always would be, did you win it? Everyone from there knew immediately what was being talked about. Inevitably, out would come the card from a pocket, and then would be very proudly displayed. When Sergeant McClure determined the procedure where soldiers were transferred from Fort Hood to Iraq or Afghanistan, which was earlier in her assignment, between classes she would go with her students to the various buildings to be outfitted and processed before shipping out. One such building was the Soldier Readiness Processing Center, where personnel would receive any routine medical attention immediately prior to deployment. Over the course of what had almost been a year at Fort Hood, Stacey had been in this building probably several hundred times. Not for herself, but as a calming influence for a bunch of young men and women heading off into the unknown. Such was the case on Thursday, November 5th, 2009. Staff Sergeant Stacey McClure went with several of her students to the processing center. While they were meeting with individual officers, she moved toward the right to see some friends of hers. Suddenly she heard a shout, Allahu Akbar! Then gunshots. Constant gunshots. She dropped down, turned, and spotted the shooter. He was a psychiatrist, one of a unit scheduled to be shipped out to Afghanistan soon. He was shooting wildly for several seconds, essentially clearing the area in front of him, when he looked to his right. There, in perfect shooter stance, with an old Beretta brought illegally into the building, was Stacey McClure. There was no waver, no quiver, no unsteadiness. There would be no verbal warning. There would be no request. Stacey was going to stop this madness. Now. Click. No shot. Click, click, click. She had taught so many students that her weapon was to be treated like a part of them, that it would one day save their life. Stacey had forgot to do the same for her Beretta. On the fourth click, Stacey leaped to her right to get away from the line of fire. His returning shot hit her left ankle and shattered it. The pain was excruciating, but Stacey knew that she posed a threat to the shooter. She had to get away. Biting her uniform to keep from screaming, Stacey kept crawling away from the shots. Suddenly she heard furniture, then people falling between shots. Then it sounded like he was outside shooting. Someone got her attention, and she crawled to a broken window in the back of the building, where she was dragged out and immediately lapsed into unconsciousness from the pain. She woke up in Scott and White Memorial Hospital in Temple, Texas, where she had undergone emergency surgery on her ankle. She then underwent multiple surgeries to repair the ankle and the wounds of infection. There were many of her bastards and bitches who came to visit Sergeant Stacey, and they brought news. Lots of it. 13 people killed. 12 soldiers and 1 civilian, with 30 people wounded. The soldier's weapon was an FN-57 semi-automatic pistol. According to one of her visitors, he had asked for the most technologically advanced weapon on the market and the one with the highest standard magazine capacity. When he had been questioned about what he was going to do with his semi-automatic, he repeated his request. Her only response was the question everyone at Fort Hood had. And they still sold it to him? Then he went and bought extra magazines and over 3,000 rounds of ammunition. And they kept selling it to him? And she found out 2 of the 4 soldiers she had gone to the processing center with had died. Other of her friends, dead and wounded. Once the physical pain started receding, she always had challenges with her left ankle. She referred to it as my way to remember my friends. The guilt and anger overtook her. She was quietly reprimanded for carrying a weapon into a no-weapons facility. She was also told she may have saved lives since her act focused the shooter on her and away from other people running out of doors and climbing out windows. That didn't upset her. What did upset her was how easily this guy was able to buy a semi-automatic weapon and 3,000 rounds of ammo. She also found out about his poor evaluations at previous posts, including Walter Reed Medical Center in D.C., and that it appeared he'd been a radical Muslim under the control of the same imam who had been spiritual leader to 2 of the 9/11 hijackers. Why was this guy allowed anywhere near an army base, she wondered. She had folks bringing her mail to her in the hospital. That's where she discovered her assaulted envelope. "You are a hero," it started, and by the time it was finished, Stacey was asking through tears if someone would please bring her computer from home to the hospital. Even though still under considerable pain, she became Fort Hood 44 that day and went over the site that night. She found out quite a bit of information about the shooting from the assaulted site, as well as being able to talk to the families of the students and friends she lost. There was anger, and there was guilt. Click, she heard it in her sleep. Click, she heard it eating. Click, she heard it talking to friends. Click, click, click. When she returned from the hospital, she took her Beretta home, dismantled, cleaned, reassembled, and test-fired it. Fine, no problem. Dismantle, clean, reassemble, test-fire. Fine, again. No matter how often she checked the Beretta, it always fired, it always worked. Except once. Click, click, click. Because of the reprimand involving carrying her weapon into the processing center, Sergeant McClure was never listed as one of the injured. She received all the benefits, including the Purple Heart and the Defensive Freedom Medal given to all victims of the shooting. That, unfortunately, fed into her rapidly escalating guilt. Due to the obvious change in mood, the effect it had on her students and supervisors, Stacey underwent several months of intensive physical and mental therapy. Although never the same Stacey McClure who walked into the processing center on Thursday, November 5th, she could at least function in society without her guilt overwhelming herself and those around her. First Lieutenant Stacey McClure never left Fort Hood due to her injuries and mental challenges. She was allowed to take a slightly early retirement, June 1st, 2018. 20 years, so a nice pension. She got a job at the same exact gun shop in Killeen that had outfitted the shooter and proceeded to teach them the new way a crazy-ass customer was supposed to be handled. She also became more active on the assaulted site, becoming close with NavyYard14. Maxine had received Fort Hood 44 among her second group of members, this group having emailed questions to the site. Maxine had Stacey listed as assaulted member number 2 to discuss the plan with. On June 2018, she told Stacey about one of us who was putting together a response concerning the gun violence epidemic, in which she talked with him. And so it was said. Friday, June 22nd, dinner at Los Cabos Seafood Bar on South Fort Hood Street in Killeen. Max sent Ray all the info. He reviewed it on a parking lot near Los Cabos and still got there a good 15 minutes early. Max had described her as about 5 foot 5 inches, short brown hair, should be wearing a dark blue suit with a white top. He saw her the moment he walked in. She was better looking than Max had described. She looked strong and tough, but there was still something around the edges. Vulnerability, softness, regret, her old friend guilt. Ray would soon find out. Over margaritas and tacos, he told her about his life and how it had changed in Antioch. She told him about her life and how it changed just up the street. Why don't you move then? You still live in your farm in Front Royal? He could see what was coming. Yep. Always will? Yep. Why? It's home. So is Fort Hood, Ray. I love the Army. I love everything about it. I never worked one single day in the Army, including that day in the processing center. If that son of a bitch had gotten lucky and killed me, I would have died a happy girl. I would have been able to do the one thing I always wanted to do, wear the uniform of an American soldier. What I do now is work. The good part is dealing with firearms, not only the shooting, but also the maintenance and safety of them. I just wish I'd been there 9 years older to tell those dumbbells not to sell to that freaking idiot. You would have never sold him a gun? Hell no. When someone comes in talking about needing a high magazine capacity, my first thought is they're not going fucking bird hunting. Sorry about the language. I'm worse than you, no worries. That was my late wife's favorite word. Let's talk about what should and shouldn't be. And he launched into the plan. Because of her background, he was more specific than he had been to anyone except perhaps Maxine. Everything was covered, forwards and backwards and even sideways. Ray honestly did not know Stacey was even interested until she asked 2 questions. 1, may I bring my Beretta? Yes, he thought. You sure can. 2, I want the kill shot on Jim Mitchell. Evenly, quietly, no wavering, no hesitation. Yep, she's in. Yes, Stacey, you can. Do you have an idea? She did and outlined it to Ray. It would involve someone she knew on the assaulted site. They had met online and talked. Both had expressed anger and concern about the lack of congressional action, and both felt that something extraordinary needed to be done for anything to change. They finished dinner, after fried ice cream, hugged goodbye, and Ray said he'd be in touch. Stacey went back to her apartment, shut the door, and suddenly felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Free of guilt. Ray called Maxine. Stacey's in. Really? Same Max. Yes, Max, really. In fact, she gave me an insulted name of someone she thinks we should contact. Who? VT57. Oh my God. Ray? What? He's next on the list. Ray laughed. Thanks, Marion. Where am I headed, Max? Home.